Welcome, everyone. Today we're diving deep into the sinking of the Titanic.
Ooh, the Titanic.
Yeah, you sent over this audio excerpt from American History Tellers.
Yes.
And I think together we can unpack a lot of insights about this tragedy
Yeah.
that I think a lot of people think they know the story of.
Right.
But I have a feeling we'll be surprised by some of the details we uncover.
Absolutely. What continues to fascinate me about the Titanic is how it just captures our
Yeah.
imaginations over a century later, right? I mean, this is a story that's been told and retold countless times.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what's really interesting about this source is it really highlights
Yeah.
that human element of this disaster.
Yeah, and the podcast does a great job just setting the scene.
Yes.
It's April 14th, 1912, and the unsinkable Titanic
right.
is sailing across the Atlantic on her maiden voyage.
Yeah. And, it's important to remember just how isolated
Yeah.
the Titanic was at the time of this collision. I
Yeah.
mean, over 400 miles from the nearest landmass. So it really was a race against time from
Right.
the moment they struck that iceberg at 11:40 p.m.
Yeah, and the American History Tellers excerpt really describes how there was almost a sense of disbelief and confusion on board in those initial moments.
Right,
Some passengers barely felt the impact, and there were no immediate alarms.
right. It's hard to fathom, but the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews,
Right?
was actually one of the few who quickly grasped the severity of the situation.
Okay.
He's called down to assess the damage, and he's stunned to find water pouring into those supposedly watertight compartments.
Wait, so these compartments weren't actually watertight? I thought that was like a key part of the Titanic's unsinkable claim.
Well, they were designed to be watertight to a certain extent.
Okay.
I mean, each compartment could be sealed off to
Mhm.
contain flooding, but the iceberg had ripped this series of gashes
Oh, wow.
along the ship's hull. That's the outer shell of the ship below the waterline.
Okay.
And the damage was so extensive that it just overwhelmed the system.
You know, listening to the podcast, I was struck by the fact that the ship's band
Yeah?
actually started playing ragtime and waltzes shortly after the collision.
Yeah.
It's almost surreal to imagine hearing music
Right.
while your ship is taking on water.
It is. It's a detail that's often highlighted because it speaks to that
Yeah.
strange atmosphere on board in those early hours.
Mm-hmm.
The music perhaps intentionally contributed to this false sense of calm.
Yeah.
I mean, some passengers were reassured by the lack of, obvious panic,
Right.
not realizing the danger lurking beneath the surface.
Right. And all the while, the crew is scrambling behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Captain Smith finally orders the lifeboats prepared at 12:25 a.m.
Right.
That's a full 45 minutes
Wow.
after impact.
Right.
Why the delay?
It's likely a combination of factors, right?
Yeah.
Initially, there was a hope that the damage could be contained.
Right.
Plus, and the podcast really emphasizes this, communication technology wasn't what it is today.
Right.
Relaying information between crew and passengers
Right.
took precious time.
But here's a truly chilling fact.
Yeah.
The American History Tellers excerpt points out that there weren't enough lifeboats
Right.
for everyone on board. Not even close.
It's one of the most tragic aspects
Yeah.
of the Titanic story. They carried enough lifeboats for roughly half of the people on board.
Jeez.
A decision that was rooted in, outdated maritime regulations.
Oh, wow.
And this misplaced faith in the ship's unsinkability.
So while the band played on,
Yeah.
this realization starts to dawn on the passengers.
Right.
Imagine the mounting fear and the ethical dilemmas
Oh, absolutely.
if it becomes clear there isn't room for everyone.
Yeah, and the evacuation wasn't a smooth process.
Right.
The podcast details how there was confusion over the women and children first protocol.
Right.
Some officers interpreted that to mean only women and children,
Oh, wow.
leading to lifeboats departing with dozens of empty seats.
It's heartbreaking to think of those lost opportunities.
Yeah.
And it highlights the incredible pressure those officers must have been under.
Absolutely. They were making life or death decisions
Yeah.
in the midst of chaos. And the source material you shared,
Yeah.
it paints a very human picture
Yeah.
of their struggles.
And in the midst of this unfolding tragedy,
Yeah.
we start to hear stories of incredible sacrifice,
Right.
courage.
The story of Ida Strauss, for example,
Yeah.
who refused to leave her husband's side.
Wow.
She chose to stay with him, even though it meant certain death.
Wow.
A powerful testament to love and loyalty.
And then there's the story of Harvey Collier, urging his wife and daughter to escape
Right.
while he stayed behind.
Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine the weight of that decision? Knowing you're sending your loved ones to safety, but also knowing it might be the last time you see them.
These are the kinds of stories that just transcend the historical facts
Right.
and remind us of the very real human cost
Yeah.
of this disaster.
And of course, there's the haunting image of the band continuing to play their music as the ship sank.
Right.
It's almost like a final act of defiance against the inevitable.
Well, it's more likely that they were playing
Right.
just trying to calm the passengers, right?
Yeah.
To offer a sense of order in the face of chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to imagine the bravery it must have taken to keep playing
Right.
as the ship went down around them.
These stories from the American History Tellers podcast really bring those final moments to life.
Yeah.
The excerpt describes the Titanic breaking apart around 2:20 to 2:30 a.m.
Right.
Imagine the sheer terror of being plunged into that frigid 28-degree water.
Survival in those conditions was incredibly unlikely.
Yeah.
Hypothermia would have set in quickly, and the vastness of the ocean would have been disorienting and utterly hopeless.
Yeah.
Chilling thought.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the podcast really drives home the point that even for those who managed to get into the lifeboats,
Yeah.
the ordeal wasn't over.
Right.
They faced hours of fear and uncertainty, adrift in the North Atlantic.
That's right. The American History Tellers excerpt mentions how some lifeboats, already filled with survivors, actually rowed away from the sinking ship, fearing they'd be swamped by desperate swimmers.
Yeah. It's a difficult situation to judge from our perspective.
Right.
Imagine the terror and confusion those in the lifeboats must have felt.
Right.
Hearing the cries of people in the water, knowing they couldn't save everyone.
It really highlights how, even in the face of disaster, human behavior can be so unpredictable.
Right.
Some risked their lives to help others, while some, understandably, acted out of self-preservation.
Right. And all this time, the Carpathians, alerted by the Titanic's distress signals, is racing towards the disaster site.
Right.
But it was a long shot. I mean, they were over 50 miles away
Wow.
when that call came through.
The podcast describes how Captain Roshan of the Carpathia
Right.
pushed his ship to its limits.
Yeah.
But it still took them hours
Right.
to reach the Titanic's last known position.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine the suspense
Oh, absolutely.
on board the Carpathia as they steam towards the unknown.
It speaks to the limitations of communication at the time.
Right.
They knew a major disaster was unfolding, but they had no idea how many survivors they would find. Or if they'd find any at all.
And then imagine that moment of relief
Right.
when they finally start pulling survivors aboard.
Yeah.
But mixed with that relief, there must have been such a profound sense of grief
Oh, absolutely.
for the scale of the loss.
The podcast highlights the stark numbers, roughly 700 rescued, over 1,500 lost.
Wow.
And those numbers reveal another layer to the tragedy, the stark difference in survival rates between men and women.
Over 75% of the women and children survive, compared to only about 20% of the men.
Yeah.
It's a direct result of that women and children first protocol.
Right.
But it also raises questions about societal norms of the time.
It's important to remember that in the early 20th century, the idea of male chivalry and self-sacrifice was deeply ingrained. Men were expected to put the safety of women and children above their own.
It makes you wonder, though, would those norms have held up if everyone had fully understood the gravity of the situation? If they knew it was a choice between staying behind and certain death, would they have adhered so strictly to that protocol?
It's a question that historians continue to debate. The Titanic sinking challenged the societal expectations.
In a very profound way.
And then there's the story of the Californian.
Oh, right.
Which the American History Tellers podcast also touches on.
Yes.
This was a ship that was actually closer to the Titanic, but failed to respond to the distress signals.
That's right. And the Californian had actually warned the Titanic about icebergs earlier that evening.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But as fate would have it,
yeah,
their radio operator had shut down for the night.
Oh, geez.
Before the collision occurred.
So they were literally within sight of the Titanic, yet completely unaware of the unfolding tragedy.
Yeah, the podcast mentions that they saw the Titanic's rockets.
Oh, wow.
But they misinterpreted them as festive signals.
Wow.
Not distress flares.
It's a tragic case of miscommunication and misunderstanding.
Absolutely.
And it speaks to the importance of clear and standardized distress signals.
Right.
something that would be improved upon in the aftermath of the disaster.
Right. What's even more haunting is that the Californian didn't realize what had happened till it was too late.
Yeah.
They arrived on the scene after the Carpathia had already rescued the survivors.
Yeah, it's a devastating what if.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's impossible to know for sure.
Right.
But if the Californian had understood those rockets, if they had responded sooner, perhaps more lives could have been saved.
Right.
And that realization fueled a lot of the controversy and finger-pointing in the aftermath of the sinking.
It's incredible how this one event, this one night in 1912, continues to generate so much discussion and debate.
I know.
Even over a century later.
It's because the Titanic disaster wasn't just a maritime tragedy.
Right.
It was a societal turning point.
Yeah.
It exposed flaws in safety regulations. It sparked discussions about class and gender roles. Right.
And it continues to fascinate us with its enduring mysteries.
And speaking of those mysteries, you mentioned the Californian being within sight of the Titanic.
Right.
But the podcast goes even further and reveals that they were actually much closer than initially believed.
Right.
Possibly even within visual range.
Wow.
That must have added fuel to the fire of the controversy surrounding their inaction. It's almost unimaginable, you know, to think that a ship could be so close to such a disaster and yet remain oblivious for so long.
Yeah.
The Californians' delayed response makes me think about just the limitations of technology at the time. Like, we take instant communication for granted today.
Yeah.
But back then, a simple misunderstanding, a missed signal, could have devastating consequences.
It's a stark reminder,
Yeah.
how far we've come in terms of communication technology.
But it also underscores the importance of human vigilance.
Right.
Of not solely relying on technology to keep us safe.
The American History Tellers podcast really dives into the aftermath of the sinking.
Yeah.
There were multiple inquiries and investigations on both sides of the Atlantic, you know, trying to piece together what happened and who was to blame.
Yeah.
What were some of the key takeaways from those investigations?
Well, they ultimately led to some significant changes in maritime regulations. For example, the requirement for ships to carry enough lifeboats for everyone on board seems like common sense to us now. But it wasn't standard practice before the Titanic.
And the investigations also highlighted the need for 24-hour radio operation on passenger ships. It's incredible to think that something as basic as having someone constantly monitoring the radio could have potentially saved countless lives that night.
And it's not just about technology. It's about procedures and training as well.
Yeah.
The Titanic disaster exposed flaws in how crews were trained to respond to emergencies, particularly in those crucial early moments.
Yeah.
And so the investigations pushed for more comprehensive safety drills and clearer protocols for evacuation.
It's amazing how this one event had such a ripple effect.
I know.
Not just on the maritime industry, but on society as a whole.
The Titanic sinking became a symbol, of the dangers of hubris and the limits of technology. It challenged long-held social norms and sparked debates about class and privilege. And these discussions continue to resonate today.
And the stories of the passengers and crew continue to captivate us. The American History Tellers podcast and the source material you provided really bring those stories to life.
Absolutely.
It's not just about the historical facts, it's about the human element. The individual experiences of hope, despair, courage, and loss.
It's a reminder that history is made up of individual lives. And that even in the face of unimaginable tragedy, there are stories of resilience, compassion, and selflessness that shine through.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Titanic, what's the one thing you want our listener to take away from all this?
I think it's this. The Titanic might be a story from the past, but its lessons are timeless. It's a reminder to never take safety for granted. To question assumptions and to remember that even in our technologically advanced world, we are still vulnerable to the forces of nature and the consequences of human error.
Well said.
Yeah.
And it's a story that continues to unfold.
Right.
New discoveries are being made about the wreck.
Yeah.
Artifacts are being recovered.
Right.
And researchers are constantly piecing together more details about the lives of those on board.
It's a story that will likely continue to fascinate and haunt us for generations to come.
If you're interested in learning more, we encourage you to explore the wealth of resources available online.
Right.
Dive into the fascinating accounts of survivors. And perhaps even visit one of the Titanic museums around the world.
It's a story that, once you start digging deeper, can really stay with you.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Titanic.
Yes.
We hope you found it insightful and perhaps even a little bit thought-provoking.
Absolutely.
Until next time.